Hello everyone, today we talk about a particularly dear topic to me because I've been close to it for a lot of years, and even though today's video will not enter into the technical, tactical, operational aspects of it that we'll hopefully deal with in many other videos in the future, is strictly connected with the broader problem. Right, I think last year I made a video titled "Have We Gotten Medieval Warfare Right?" Right, I think it was exactly 1 year ago, and I had just finished a doctorate about that specific issue, and it was an important realization for me, because the more I study medieval history, the more I realize how much we still read it through patterns that really do not make too much sense, or at least are heavily biased mostly by our own modernistic and secularistic view of the past in general, for reasons that we'll discuss today also in part, and that contain among the various prejudices, in fact, the alleged, let's say, underestimation of infantry, right, of the commoners, of the pietaille, and other, in fact, foot soldiers by the knightly elite for some sort of romantic chivalric bias that we decided to arbitrarily attach to medieval nobility, and that mostly instead tells a lot about ourselves, and mostly the need to flatter fundamentally the democraticistic rather than democratic even, and in fact republicanistic as well, ideals that in fact the revolutions of the 18th and 19th century brought on the foreign, in the states, in the cultures we still live in. And when you read, especially medieval literature, late medieval literature, I would say mostly, and also especially the Renaissance one, etc., you do realize that there is a sense of sunset, what has been defined by Huizinga, in fact, as the sunset of the Middle Ages, this sense of a broader decline of chivalric ideals, of the affirmation of firearms, of the footmen, and there are many different ways actually this has eventually declined itself in different countries in Europe. For example, a great watershed as always was the Reformation, seeing what was this ideal kind, even in fact when not reflecting reality, interpreted as, and within which narrative. And you would be surprised by how alive still that narrative, a very heavily biased one, most of the cases, still is still familiar is to our culture, to our language, to our way of thinking. And you do realize that there was an ideal, of course, also in the Middle Ages, from which we have developed also the later one, and for which mostly in the 19th century we've come to reconstruct the Middle Ages. True that unironically started within the same refusal, let's say, of in the creation actually of the Middle Ages, is in fact this sort of unworthy era in between the classical times and the and modernity that somewhat didn't even deserve a qualifying name on its own. But we will not explain how and why this happened. We will just try to make a point relatively to high and especially late medieval warfare, and why these prejudices towards kind of knights that would launch themselves into a forest of pikes and getting massacred in several instances, etc., actually would derive from a refusal or kind of a or incapacity, a mental form of cultural fault that wouldn't accept that the infantry was rising, allegedly as the future and whatever. Because if you study actual campaigns, battles, and you're acquainted with the basics really of medieval strategy, tactics, armaments, etc., you realize that there is hardly any of that inside, right? The fact that armies that were prevalently based on cavalry at a point were defeated in certain specific contexts that you should already be able to dimension compared to the rest of Europe at that time, and knowing also how other Europeans had been fighting, would keep fighting in some instances, do not really display this, do not really prove at all. First of all, the idea that cavalry suddenly declined just for essentially a technologistic reason, nor that the infantry at all had any prosperous future as a class, right? If anything, the moment of a knightly decline in a political and social sense is also the one in which the commoners are brought under and will not come out for several hundred years until, in fact, the aforementioned 18th, 19th century revolutions. And the modern age has absolutely nothing to do with any, democratically translated humanistic ideals in terms of a strength of the commoners or whatever, right? The Renaissance infantries were just paid soldiers that worked for the most ultra-elite aristocracy that had fundamentally subjugated them in any single field, politically, socially, etc. But at the end of the Middle Ages. And great, we could even just make this video about the philosophy of history that lays underneath this view, because if you are not habituated to consider that most of human history, and still you can argue all of it still in our days, is actually an elite process that actually accomplishes an incredible lot and doesn't quite exist in of itself just because it has oppressed, but literally because others have given up their rights, and actually the elite tries just to push further and maintaining, in fact, higher standards that the commoners fundamentally don't care about, because they prefer just to remain confined into their own mediocrity and kind of even, in fact, giving up what up to a certain point their ancestors thought to be sacred, and they are the direct responsibles always for any form of totalitarianism, dictatorship, authoritarian regime, because no government can rule without the support of the people, right? There is no way. It doesn't exist in human history. You can't. There are two complex systems. A single government, doesn't matter how, apparently structured it is. That structure does not actually exist. That structure exists only in function of the people's support, right? And any kind of government is exclusively the absolute mirroring of the people, right? That it rules, and so it's difficult not to see, of course, a conflict ongoing. But that's exactly the point, right? We could make interesting videos regarding that specific view, but the point being is that by removing the concept that emperors, popes, kings, princes, etc. were actually pretty worthy, capable, skillful rulers that carried out one of the single, if not the single, most dramatic advancement in the history of civilization, and that the entire Western identity is fundamentally based in the accomplishments of these specific figures, surely supported again by the people, but in that hierarchical guise and in a universal frame that fundamentally today we refuse to accept it even existed concretely. It's obvious that you cannot appreciate, you will always think that the elite was some sort of evil tyranny that exploited the others, and that we freed ourselves at some point from it for some strange reason, because if this elite had taken over for centuries. You don't clearly understand what the people were doing at that point, or how was it possible that they could recover power at some point. If this had been just, a negative, regressive thing, we would simply implode it and disappeared as a civilization or even as a species. You cannot understand equally what anything from a political, military, and social point of view, right? So, why did infantry rise? In times in which actually commoners were going down politically and socially, that's a, from a military point of view, that's something you should explain, right? And that we hardly do, because the answer is actually that infantry was engineered by the ultra elite to fight each other, and actually developing modernity and lots of other things that were quite useful for civilizational development to this day, in the good side of it, as long as there is always a bad side of modernity that in fact we have also removed. That is, again, modernity is not just a sort of form of tolerance or flexibility or relativism. Modernity should be about the possibility of providing every person with imperial power, which actually was the same concept that laid at the root of the universal tradition since ancient times. And the reason why certain peoples took over the world is that they were given that chance, and they did it, right? And military history also shows this dramatically well, and it has barely anything to do with a sort of detached, an empty, and negative freedom for which, all our values should supposedly be about, leaving a person being just sitting there doing nothing, if not maybe actually complaining to be parasitically maintained by other people who actually do something in their lives. And as if, think things like same pressure, oppression, proper, and stimulation, and authority, and command, and brutal discipline, and order, and teaching, and position weren't actually the sap of human civilization per se, right? And the idea that existed in traditional times is that the two things could not exist without the other. You see, the Apollonian cannot exist without the Dionysian. The Uranian cannot exist without the Chthonic. The male cannot exist without the female, because the entire thing was made by the unity and by the hierarchy that was established in this principle of reciprocity between these entities, right? And these are deep concepts also, in psychoanalysis, if you study Jung, but also in the same von Clausewitz, in the same strategic culture. So what has happened rather is that we have transformed into some sort of iconoclasts that give up responsibility by rejecting essentially to suffer, to make any effort, to actually create something, to bring order, to know how to do it. And therefore, when we look at also things that happened in the past, we say, well, this thing ended because, first of all, it's a teleological, deterministic, relativistic, materialistic thing. It had to happen forcibly because, nothing happens. You can't really change things. That's the slave mentality, as a matter of fact, taking over. Except in the past, in fact, the slave mentality worked because there were masters, right? And master and slave were a pretty damn good duo to make civilization develop. And slavery has many shades and forms, and it's not just the worst of what you can imagine. But it's a broader, it's an archetypal principle, right? But the idea again is that for some reason we narcissistically decided that whatever we have created by the destruction of tradition must forcibly be better than anything else, because if it did, we would basically have to admit our own failure as a civilization, or at least our own decline, and complete lack of individual worth, and again, responsibility and morality, etc. And so what did happen? Towards middle, we invented, literally, this entire, shameful and abominable pile of garbage called the military revolution, which never existed. And that at some point, the the people was rising to a point that the nobility, the chivalry class, the knights, the military men, the professionals, fundamentally had not and could not contemplate, could not accept, could not exist, and whatever. The difference with our own times is that the elite, in fact, ruled at the time, and they actually managed the world. There weren't people sitting there in castles on the top of pile of money, doing nothing and laughing at grotesquely from their towers' windows at the peasants breaking their backs in the field. There were people who were managing powerfully, lordly, entire countries and bringing them to further stabilization, centralization, political, social development, and consolidation is essentially what we got, right? If you wonder where the Renaissance emerged from, right, it was essentially medieval civilization creating it, right? It was not the end of a dark period. It was just the implementation of what medieval civilization produced massively, right? And actually, even in a regressive, in a critical phase, because the peak of medieval civilization is by the 13th to 14th century, and in fact, this is the one that we're discussing today, and where that, in fact, in the latter phase, this infantry rise was actually the most truly political and social, right, and has absolutely nothing, but I want to stress nothing, to do in any form and content with what happened in the later medieval centuries, right? People are convinced that essentially infantry began to rise in importance at this point, and it linearly evolved towards taking over and equating that democratic revolution, whatever they think it really was, because there was not even ever such a thing, telling the truth, historically. But it's not because I depreciate the concept of democracy. I personally don't, right? It's a disgusting name because it comes from the demos. So it's again, an appropriation from the Fourth Estate of an accomplishment that basically it has nothing to do, because the actual democratic revolutions were not made by the Fourth Estate, by the demos, right? If anything, at some point, the demos were just used instrumentally as a brute force, but it was always and only the Third Estate at best that pioneered these changes, and the Fourth Estate always remained below, and it still does, and formally or informally, and therefore it's not much of a matter of democracy, really. The Middle Ages stopped somewhere between 1792 and 1918. If we really want to think the real, especially from a strictly military point of view, I'm deeply convinced this as a polemologist, that is the actual end date of the Middle Ages, because the fundamentals were still those ones, right? And again, I'm not even against what happened later in theory, right? Just as always, you have a good, you can always choose for better for worse. If you choose for worse, even if you go on a certain path you have chosen for worse, you could do better, right? And changes also happen for specific reasons, part of which we should, yes, celebrate about our own culture, also the one we call at least democratic, wrongly, and that in fact causes an enormous, even just terminological confusion, because it's like, again, people will still think that there is such a thing like capitalism, etc. We have been essentially hijacked lexicologically by some, fanatic ideologies that fortunately at some level had nothing but these instruments to impose to us, because, just across the court, and we perfectly know what it was like. But for not talking about the rest of the world in general, but the main point here is that the nobility as such has been demonized fundamentally into some sort of incompetent, bombastic, egomaniacal buffoons that just went themselves being stupidly butchered against commoner infantry formations that were evidently superior to them, and that these imbeciles just charged into because they didn't believe it was, right? This is the same idea. It's the same hatred, really, that exists a bit against the made-up concept of some tyranny, like, for example, I don't know, anything Roman has been desecrated, that also has basically the pillar of Western European tradition, and still hated because of, again, the destruction of the same universal unity, coming from this gradual degeneration that happened since the origins in general, even the archetypal and the divine, what were thought to be the sacred divine one, to this day. And that is also mostly a gnoseological problem as well. I mean, that is, people have stopped to know, right? You would think that, for example, the left is evil because it's been engineering all this. Yes, there was a time where this happened, where people actually studied Marx in German and Lenin in Russian and were actual communists, and they knew how to attempt at least the disintegration of humanity. Today we have arrived to the point in which the left is just a bunch of, just like the right, radically underschooled, undereducated, and culturally underdeveloped people that just are, trained and set like to say certain things, but they don't even see the strategic point of that anymore. And that is the consequence, actually, of that evil machination, but to the point that you cannot rely on these individuals anymore, because they literally, mission accomplished if these people don't know anything about history, about religion, absolutely forget that, for example, conservatives have any idea what a universal tradition is. They had never heard of it. It's not that they actually own it, but they are not up to its standards. They have never heard of that, nor from their families, from their church, from their school, whatever. It hasn't been existing for several generations now. Even you could argue even some couple of 100 years, right? Where, however, the process of the generation was already, pretty heavy and intense. But of course, the Marxistic kind of socioeconomical bias, the idea of trade grows, so commoners become richer and they can't fight against the noble, and that's really the point. That the noble do not accept this, and it's a completely fictional and undocumented, unevidenced, unscientific view of the Middle Ages that still, I think, a good 90% of people do own, because that's what instead they have been told. And they have never studied military history, because of course nobody today does, right? Just the art of war. I think there are just a very few people in the world, but not a few, like, we're talking about the range of tens of thousands. We're talking about you can be strict up to saying that maybe they're just a handful, but I don't think they are more than some hundreds at this point. And I doubt seriously at this point of even the most famous ones' skills, because that's simply proven. So it's part of a broader decline in the generation that has made us believe, in a way, that even what happened, if we were to find an evidence and a source to this prejudice of the nobleman being competent in front of the rise of infantry, as if, by the way, this was a class struggle where the infantry fought separated from the nobility. That's just, for any military historian, the most stupid thing you can say, and that already tells you how wrong conceptually and abstractly you have been shipwrecked ideologically to thinking these things. Is evidenced by some literature that complains about the decline of chivalry, etc., mostly from a moral point of view, right? It's not even necessarily just a technical point of view. Even when you as we will see, that there are examples that, of course, provide the prototype of guns, of pole arms, of at least the commoners' weapons. Right, there is not much an attention towards the tactical issue, right? If you read medieval sources about warfare, they don't actually care about technology, because of course technology alone doesn't have any value whatsoever. They are morally concerned, right? And of course, for a world like ours that doesn't give a damn about morality, because it doesn't fundamentally understand what it is anymore. And I'm serious about this. Morality is not what you think people should behave. Morality is a very specific thing that must be learned doctrinally, and in fact scientifically. It's really no person's opinion, really. It's a universal principle. In the moment in which you disintegrate that, of course, you're able to disintegrate everything, including history, including how these armies fought, and what was the habitual, operational, strategic, tactical practice. Because, again, have you ever studied a campaign or a battle? And I mean, by studying it, I mean for real, not buying an Osprey booklet and reading it and saying, oh, wow, now I know what kind of medieval warfare was about. I'm actually talking about you seizing all the sources that talk about a specific, even if it were just a battle, it's not a campaign because it's even more messed up, but a battle, like 30, 40 sources that you are able to translate from Latin, from vernacular, and to actually reconstruct the battle, and also under the light of the most updated historiography. Of course not, right? It's not that if you read some of that somewhere, or you read books of people that do this, that do not exist, by the way, even properly from a methodological point of view, you are actually competent in that. It does not happen, right? It doesn't happen in any field. You have to work with that, otherwise you cannot know. So you say, but why do you make this videos? Well, if anything, to make people aware of this, not the fact that I can make the work for them. This is what I always say. But just to render them aware that if you are flattered into thinking that, again, mediocrity is a value, and that you should essentially accept yourself just for the way you are, basically you're done for, like a human being. I mean, sorry to tell you, but that's the entire point that we are discussing at Schwerpunkt, and that we are evidencing from something that goes beyond even just a read, but a critical, in fact, analysis of history, of the sources, making history as much as we can. Even though these videos appear to me always extremely superficial compared, in fact, to the depth and complexity of history itself, that at some point maybe I will make a video about one of my articles, for example, and they're modest, like which is just 30 pages, but just to make you understand how just a minimal thing that you may seem to be minimal may open a Pandora box of concerns, of problems, of issues, of interpretational difficulties that basically never end, and it makes you understand how really limited we are, and that we are not. We must absolutely not be confident about ourselves in the shapeless way that we have been convinced to be. And that's the same reason you would be surprised by when I'm talking about all this, is that why we think that after all it's easy to stop a cavalry charge, right? What does it take? A pike, you stay firm, orderly, and yeah, you have to be kind of motivated, but it's not so important, and you will stop cavalry all the time, right? That's it, right? At least a parity of some given numbers of quotas that you will have to break your hand to determine, and of course do not make any sense. Well, of course, those imbeciles of 14th century European knight, of course, was just an imbecile, because you know better how to stop their charge, right? And you especially know why commoners up to those years had always had been dominated by the feudal elite, and they hadn't thought ever that, oh my God, they could face it in battle, because it's just that's something you don't think normally, like in the Middle Ages, right? Or frequently, or to some, or in the normal political, military, or social dialectic of any given time in history. Well, that's the main problem that we have. So just to make a broader picture, let's say, of what's the feudal pietae, mostly in the pre-13th century, really, was. We're talking about so-called armigeri in the sources, so armed bears, people that were actually armed, because armatus means very often cuirassed, or armigerus stands for he who bears arms. Then, of course, missile troops, pioneers of some sort. And let's say in high medieval times, these people were not dramatically well equipped, right? They were equipped in a functional way for what warfare at the time could afford. So it's also the reflection of their own possibilities. And as you know, in war, most of the time, it's not the best that makes the thing, but what is good enough. There wasn't a dramatic amount of collective training, right? And that's in part also because, of course, that reflected in fact, these communities had somewhat given up their liberty in exchange for protection, so providing also the means to their lords for fighting the way they did, and gradually also, yes, trying to disarm them, etc. But in actual fact, really always fighting alongside them, right? And there is even here a bias that would like to look at these people and say, well, they were not really fighters, right? Or at least, they were not supposed to be on a regular basis. They were just, maybe watchers. They were field aides of some sort. They weren't really even expected how to fight. This is not really true at all, right? If you look at the Garçon, at the Marmaglia, for example, at other this kind of what they were thought to be like, yes, underworldly people. They were the Chthonic, the Dionysian, right? They were under the Apollonian or Uranian masters that dominated them from the top of their detre. But they were still functional again. Without them, the knights couldn't fight, right? So they did have some level of training. They did have some important effectiveness. If it had been even just for logistical mansions, right? You haven't said just a few, right? Knowing how to erect even just a field fortification, or having to blockade an enemy stronghold, because otherwise you can't really besiege it in the first place. But these people did fight, right? They had to provide with a barrier, not just some sort of labor force brought there, but just knights that fought. That never happened. Historically, the same heroic warfare in the dawn of times never really existed as in the form of one versus one guy and the others just watching at a distance. And the only reason why we think these troops were not, and so the idea of oppression, because you see, this is where it gets down to, for centuries, certain realities that, that didn't document certain estates, certain groups, certain communities, were thought to equate to, okay, these people didn't have any role in anything. That's just because you lack documentation of that. There are certain periods of the Middle Ages where, it's absolutely normal not to have information about that. It always exists, telling you the truth, if you really dig well and you know how to have a comprehensive view, which is also now doesn't exist anymore, because you have to be just hyper specialized only one thing and the rest does not exist, right? So you can become better a relativist, a determinist, etc. And historiography, if anything, has ascertained today that in fact this was a prejudice, that infantry always had a great relevance throughout all feudal warfare, even during the peak, in fact, of feudalism, second half of the 12th to the 13th century. The idea of a Middle Ages dominated by the feudal elite in council as on the field is a classist interpretation. None of these people fought without the commoners, right? And this was true the other way around, right? So even when we look at what happened, especially in the first half of the 14th century, where commoners, just for those 50 years, then it stops, and then it doesn't happen anymore, where properly commoners like bourgeois and rustics at a point win alone, right, as solely foot armies. We will see better now. Say feudal armies with cavalry and infantry, by the way, and then it stops with Black Death that crushes the demographic and agricultural backbone of these communities, and so it's just from later on that you have infantry taking over again when it's under the princes and engineered by them, right? You can have, of course, infringe realities of you can of course measure, I don't know, this 200 infantry unit defeated this 40 knights. Yeah, it happened. Look at here. Yeah, okay, but you have to think at the broader warfare at the time. You should have at least a broader idea of what were all the major military engagements in Europe at a given time and comparing them. And so, if that happened, yeah, every once in a while here and there, but it's not statistically meaningful. You cannot talk about, okay, there were infantry victories, it was, just a great development of the arm, etc. No, not really, right? And so it's not really strange. In fact, what really happened since the early Middle Ages is that cavalry is normally stronger already, but infantry can also defeat it, and there are many examples. And it's just, in fact, during the 12th and the 13th century that, at least in specific areas, the most advanced, by the way, of Western Europe, cavalry becomes decisive, right? And the reason why it had difficulties in the fringe areas is not that the fringe areas were more military effective, it's that they could, at a point, score, I don't know, they could successfully ambush one of these guys. And so what, right? Could they control the lowlands? Could they be a civilization on their own? No, right? So that is not... say a single victory doesn't mean anything per se, and you should be able to contextualize it for what it is, right? And naturally, professionalism is the big divide still, and that's why the term miles, that in Latin indicated essentially the soldier in general, and more specifically the legionnaire, for most, in fact, of Roman history, and that means it's a salaried trooper because he literally received the millet since, at least traditionally, since the siege of Veii, right, way before Marius, for example. But in the Middle Ages is attributed just to the horsemen, or at least certain types of horsemen, or at least the elite ones. And telling the truth, by the 13th century, the divide between even the squires and other lesser, say, lighter types of mounted troopers and the knights had been gapped, right? So they were all milites, even though they were not really knights, dubbed and noble and all, right? That's something we have been discussing, and we'll hold already, but we will come back on because sometimes people keep making me some questions about this, but it's really simpler than it sounds. It's just that you can't really pinpoint any specific. You can't say, yeah, by a certain time in this country specifically, juridically, the knight, it was this from a political point of view, from a juridical point of view, from a social point of view, from a military point of view, but it's very complex, right? And very often, even there, we don't even have an actual statistic even as to back everything. It's a very in-depth, critical, set of information that you should be able to pioneer after years of expertise and study, not really, pretending that it's just a random number that you can't give it, a Soviet way of making history, telling you the truth. So, consequently, the pedites, and this is interesting because you see in Latin and in Roman times properly, you had the equites and the pedites. So you had the horsemen and the footmen, while the milites were the soldiers, meaning how professional they were, right? And it wasn't that distinction. Instead, the pedites in this regard in medieval times, even though actually they were paid, right? There were many mercenaries, especially from the 12th century. Think about the Brabançons. By the way, they were in fact the scum of the earth, really. But they were, as long as they were paid, they could be ideally conceived in a grammar Nazi ideal abstract way, militaries, but they weren't, as a matter of fact. Nobody would think of them like that, right? They were just the footmen. And there was, in fact, a big deal of demonization, surely, projected on them. This is true, right? It was part of, not just of Western civilization, it was pretty much all there. The commoners were just the lesser people most of the times, and they had always been, right? Even the most kind of less stratified societies in, I don't know, tribal cultures, etc. There was never such a thing like, everybody was the same. The aristocracy always looked down on this people and said, basically they don't even deserve to be like that. There was a incredibly individualistic mentality. This is true, but naturally in the Middle Ages also the mythology of this, that knights just thought about themselves and didn't have a notion of how important was to maintain a collective discipline, and by which degree we mean this, is quite relevant, because if it's a matter of making your convoy charging before the one of another nobleman that you're in competition with, it is a thing, but at the same time that's not ever kind of disjuncted from the fact that this problem would occur in battle when it was objectively difficult to find the right moment when to charge. So you cannot distinguish it even from a strictly military problem, and the fact that maybe a clergyman describing the story doesn't get that, or even actually you don't get it because the clergyman would have implied it in some way, or at least given it for granted, for obvious, right, given what the situation was at the time, doesn't legitimize you to talk shit about these people that surely were much more intelligent and especially capable than you. So, and it goes without saying that the pettites were not recommendable people. First of all, they absorbed a sort of corvée role, right? What the peasant could do in terms of, producing more for the lord by custom or some necessity that, the same peasant was importantly connected to. Again, classism finds no places. Lords weren't squeezing peasants by making them break their back more than in the fields more than usual, because again, they were just there sadistically torturing their subjects, right? Those were an enormously important asset. They were still human beings that could revolt, by the way, because it would happen as well, especially actually in pre-13th, 14th century time. The peasantry was very autonomous, very warlike, and of course, as all the people always are, some of the most viciously and properly evilly brutal and violent and sadistic, actually, component of the community as such. But they'll turn, because the lord was pressured by other lords, and the people living in his land cared about making their own lord, supporting their own lord in that clash, because otherwise somebody would have really come to destroy their lives and killing them and raping their wives and butchering their newborn babies. But we know that because from the chronicles it normally happened, right? There was really nothing so strange. I mean, yes, it caused actually some disconcertment, but which is relevant for those time moral standards as well. But that's also what these same people did, as a matter of fact, on each other, right? Look at what peasants do, and they still shoot at each other for stupid issues like fences, etc. They are not stupid, by the way, in their own way, but still, that's how quick they are to come to that. So of course the infantry were emarginated people, poor people that essentially lived out of the leftovers of the loot. They were the scum of the battlefields, and they often joined historically exactly because they followed the trail of the lords, right? If there is a big army, we've seen it many times in many medieval warfare videos, a big army being summoned, and this is known months in advance everywhere. There are people flocking from literally every freaking where, like in the nomadic world, even from thousands of kilometers away, just to come looting, right? And it would be somewhat normal, and there were in fact some roamers, as we were saying before. We were mentioning the Brabançons, just to make an example. These people were Apolides. They lived on the run, right? Roaming, wandering, and massacring, raping in the they lived out that. It was, again, given the general misery of that world, it was not necessarily a worse way of living than in the farms, right? In any case, they had a reputation of this kind. However, the difference is really, and this is a bit in fact, even the stereotypical picture inside of the story, because from quite a while, and it would be very interesting to look even at the prehistory of such things, and you know that I have a lot of communal history on my channel. I'm basically the only person on the entire YouTube making, or the internet likely, making communal military history, and people don't even know what it is. That is, a silver, a massive chunk of medieval civilization from historical knowledge. Well, nothing can go wrong, right? It's like, ripping a kidney off of a person. Well, after all, he has another one, so, it's not a big deal, right? Ignorance doesn't harm anyone, of course, right? Until, it does, but at least, you're in denial, so that's how it really works nowadays. And we will hopefully start making very serious, also properly military history about communal infantries and communal armies in general, because of course they included also knights, etc., as we've often seen. But the communal infantries, the communal armies in general, were next to, in fact, the knights were still or however, also to the, as we've seen, just mounted soldiers. The petites played an important role, were really the counter-altar also of the feudal hierarchy. These communities had developed within the same universal hierarchy, the empire, the kings, etc., but already at the provincial level, some communes could take over, right? And as such, they did, from a political, hence a military point of view, right? They had the force of doing that. And these things were really, but I mean really, something else, right? And there are some, even in here, we don't have to think that the commune was something civilizationally opposed to the feudal hierarchy. This is yet another myth that we have built around the fact that, of course, for a person living in the 20th, well, even just in the 19th, 20th, 21st century, like, city-states are, and their citizens, let's say, are a more sympathetic model than, I don't know, a feudal lord or an emperor or whatever. Some things that we have lost any knowledge of because we think it's tyranny, right? The communes absolutely didn't have that, nor a democratic nature, because the demos never ruled there, nor basically almost virtually in any other city government ever historically, except maybe the most radical Athens at some point. But of course it was a shipwreck. It was just like the first, it was just like Jacobinism, or the first hours of Bolshevism. It's this kind of just brutal, nonsensical, animal-like, popular radical violence channeled by for a very specific political purpose, by some ideologues, and then equally brutally repressed afterwards, and so dramatically worsening their condition, even compared to the previous one they owned. And they saw themselves still as free men. Regarding this, I made a video just recently about the importance of the military nature and the consular government in the Italian communes that are the best example that now we will also comment on, together with the Flemish and the Swiss. The let's say the word, the embodiment of nobility, actually, and in the sense of the imperium that entailed, in the freedom, in the citizens that were free men, right? So these people were free because they had the force to be free, and positively free. That is to say, within still a government, with a hierarchy, with an order, with a discipline. And this was all mirrored on the battlefield, because they had hell of armies that were easily among, if not at some point, the most advanced in medieval Europe. And this entire communal dimension, and again, I am the only person talking about this on the internet, but it seems to me it's ridiculously evident even that it's completely unknown to most Westerners, let's not even talk about the rest of the world, but still by the same people that actually would be allegedly expert, passionate amateurs, etc. of medieval history, and that we're not talking about one specific place, like 1/20th of Europe. We're talking about up to 1/4 of Europe, right? If anything, demographically, and more than that, if you add that wealth was overwhelmingly concentrated there as well. And so something that should account by 1/3 at least of the entire medieval history and warfare. But that for some reason people don't care about and don't know about, and prefer to see the Middle Ages as, some kind of strange, not feudal, that was a serious thing, but a feudalistic, a romanticistic delusion, and misrepresentation, and degeneration of anything that the Middle Ages actually were. And since here we talk especially about military history, which is literally about killing people, and you must have some reason for doing that at least should come into serious examination. Well, you should. These are things you should take into account. If anything, even for understanding why we have a military and what that is supposed to do, and what kind of awareness a citizen should have. So this is the good side of modernity, actually, in terms of political meaning, because that's where it gets down to. And of course, the moral misery in which we live nowadays is perfectly reflected at all levels, also by the refusal of getting into these matters and keeping to ignore past history of the world, and then complaining because the world sucks, right? The world doesn't suck because there is some strange odd factor, because of capitalism, because of oppression. The world sucks because people suck, right? The chances are that you suck, right? We all do pretty badly at many levels. We all know that. But of course, you don't want to say it out loud because, again, you have decided not to accept any form of discomfort because, God forbid, you may achieve something in your life. But, that's in fact apparently not interesting, right? Better to be a parasite and just ending your life. I already made videos about the material wealth of communal infantry. I talked about the Italian communal armies, the Flemish communal armies. I talked about the European communes in general, and I will keep talking about them, and we will see battles in which they were also in fact involved. I made videos about the Battle of Courtrai, about the Battle of Legnano. I think it was one of the first ones I made, and it's terrifying. I should remake it. Oddly enough, we have never talked about the Lombard League, for example, or other also leagues, for example, the German ones, some other, let's say, infantries that were not even properly communal, but were kind of rustic, or even subject ones, but still had an importance, such as, the Frisian ones, the Scottish ones as well. I made videos actually about Scottish infantry during the 14th century, which is exactly that thing. So more or less, if you dig in my playlist, in my playlists that have become dramatically many, but if you type infantry, right, you will. It's easier in the sense to find anything, just at a guess, right? So if you that should be easy, like medieval infantry warfare or something like that. You find plenty of this stuff, but we should do it in a much more systemic and articulated way. Well, the communal infantry was characterized since the 12th century, and also with a greater clarity, probably also a matter of documentation, starting from the 13th century. as organized on the base of the urban district communities, or in fact the also the guilds, as you know, and they were remarkably well armed and trained, right? Regarding how they did that, unfortunately, we don't know much, right? The way they were armed, for example, in theory they should have provided with their own equipment, as it was ideally possible at some point. The state actually always paid something, but at a point you realize that specific gear and it was at least produced by the state and then kept by these people, even at home, likely, right? I don't know. Today in Switzerland, there are people with light machine guns at home, so you can think that things didn't change that much. But the crucial aspect of who supplied this, in many ways, is all, because you realize that the communes, by the way, centralize further, and so they control, importantly, the same military and paramilitary forces in quite interesting way. We just lack the actual documents. That is, we don't know, right? We don't know whether we haven't searched well in the archives, or likely properly this kind of documents don't have not survived, or have not existed in a way that would make them survive at the end of the day. Also because, of course, medieval communities were very much like, it was just a regulation of a previous autonomous armament, right? So there was a time where, at this point in high medieval time, during the high Middle Ages, it was not really a state that could control. Like the state was formed by the people eventually, that were already in arms and that decided to self-regulate themselves regarding that, right? So today we depend entirely on the state, but we don't realize that still today we make the state. Well, those people had it much clearer than us in mind. The training is the same. Like there were some festivals, games, things like this, in which we know that the city mob usually started fighting each other. These were mock battles, but rapidly escalating at times into something bigger that not even the police could control. At a point, people got killed, but these things went on in Europe. I think like up to the 18th, the 19th century was normal, right? To have, I know it for sure, like in the places where also where I come from, it was kind of normal to stab each other, to kill each other, to battle on the bridges from one side of the city to another. It was just the way, in fact, these paramilitary forces trained themselves, and these manifestations had always occurred. I mean, St. Augustine talks about this still, and so we think that throughout early medieval times, the way infantry forces, or at least commoners forces in general, trained was this one. And it's not that knights technically did it, let's say, in a very different form, right? They just did it for a longer time with better equipment for a lifetime. This just happened every once in a while to keep, say, the community in shape regarding probably the aptness to violence, what that in many ways is the most important thing, because again, it's not even as you know, warfare is hardly a technical thing. It's just how much you want to kill the person on the other side. It's not even important how you're armed at the end of the day. But they were armed well as well. And in fact, there were some regulations regarding also these games, regarding properly the weapons that could be used. There were all a series of protections, because they actually beat it and kill each other on a regular basis. There's some of these things are impressive. For example, in the same, I don't know, speaking of the Italian communes, if you look at the famous Mons-en-Pevele or other of this kind of medieval games, competitions, some are actually also with arms. There's the joust, etc. But the groups, like the supporters, like it's like the hooliganism. It's the same exact concept. After these competitions, they beat the shit out of each other. I mean, and they really, I mean, it's a bloodshed, and that's what supporters again, of squads really do. That's the chthonic mob still of the communal world. Like at the scum of the earth, still. Again, the Romans said panem et circenses. The plebs had to be kept happy. So look at stadiums, look at what kind of people on average frequent them, and ask yourself, and I know all kind of people go there, but this is exactly the point, that the so-called commoners, so the common people, tend to do that, and there's a specific reason why they do that, and in that way. Right, it's all in with the mafia, with the mob. It's simply, again, the way people organize themselves also autonomously in parastatal realities, conceptually. And that's exactly what it was like in the Middle Ages, right? This is the fascinating aspect of even the esprit de corps. Of course, they, like in most cases, of course, when you compare that to professional military force, these people do not exist. Right, it's just a very lame paramilitary way of thinking, and that's why conceptually, if you don't have that damn permanent professional army, these are all barbarians that you can disperse and that will just carry out guerrilla and hide in the mountains, and they will keep carrying out resistance, but living in shit while civilizations prosper. Right, so this is a massive divide, morally and scientifically, because the entire history of civilization was based on the superiority of collective military organization over those who didn't have it, and it's an incredibly powerful civilizational measure. Yes, civilizationals do have levels; they can be compared. Right, other thing that we have not, every culture is different. You have just to accept the way it is. No, exactly because it's different. I really don't have to. Right, if something is better or worse, it's my task, my moral and scientific duty as a human being to determine it, right? Hell, it may be the single most important thing a sane civilization is supposed to do, to prove that constantly, right? Just talking about people today, that even niche in those YouTube videos, channels that talk about the perspectives, like, I want to indoctrinate myself in an echo chamber of this people's perspective, and the rest doesn't have to exist. Yes, because the Clausewitzian principle of reciprocity is killed and destroyed, because you're just alienating yourself from reality, not pursuing the universal traditional goal that all the world conquerors had, that is to comprehend the universe in themselves. You're just alienating yourself from reality because you're too weak and you don't want to know what the world is, because it would face you with your self-caused insignificance as a person, and that's what you cannot stand, right? So you want just somebody who gives you the drugs to remain in that state. In any case, the esprit de corps was fundamental, right? The communes, as we've seen, had a hell of municipal identities that dated straight back from Roman times in most of the cases. The communes were founded with an exquisitely military identity, right? The identity of the communes was founded on being freemen that bore arms, right? And this was the entirety of it was the Romano-Germanic backbone there that had survived in these centers that began to evolve also as states on their own in this period, and they knew each other. They lived all in the same place. So even though, as we've seen in the communal history videos, there were countless interferences and influences, intersections, etc., these were hardly, again, absolute states, and these things do not exist even today, in spite of we live in the single strongest statal phase in the history of mankind. But it still was a big deal for medieval standards, right? And they developed in forms that even surpassed at a point the strictly defensive side of the story, right? Even though this remained mostly the norm, right? As I explained in communal history videos, there are wild differences between European communes and the same concept of city-state is abused very often because it's attributed to realities that weren't states but kind of just towns. And it was a big difference in this regard. But the point is that as these armies grew, even the same infantries that had an enormous power began at some point to take on the offensive on the battlefield, right? And this happened especially with the Italian communes, with not much of the others, telling the truth, because the offensive is something that fully would be achieved only by the Swiss in the mid-15th century as infantry, in medieval times, right? They had finally the successful collective training to uniformly offend on a regular basis. But if you look especially at the late 13th, early, say, first half of 14th century Italian infantry, they did offend as hell too, and the numbers are also impressive there, and there was probably something proto-modern in that even here, as always, was cut down by the mid-14th century crisis, because at that point even the Italian and the massive Italian infantry wings collapsed. But we will see now what we're talking about. The reason why infantry was mostly defensive is obvious. They couldn't offend. I mean, they would have been at disadvantage by doing that, because in the moment of the offense, you are basically using the weak form of war, but with a positive aim. So if you have enough advantage to essentially succeed in spite of the disadvantage posed by the attack, if anything, because you have to move, lose energies and cohesion, etc., you do it, right? And that's why cavalry had it, because cavalry only attacks as an arm, right? That's the only thing it does. So even the same fact it developed because it could do that. Infantry was instead preferring the defensive, a strong form of war, but with the negative aim, because you're basically exposing yourself to the enemy initiative. But as you know, battlefields are not basketball playgrounds, so not even cavalry could really operate anywhere. Infantry had a greater adaptability on the ground, and so very often while they advanced and were trained to, especially next to the infantry, but to the cavalry, but sometimes even autonomously, as we were just saying, before the Swiss of the mid-15th century did again have nothing to do, even with the same Swiss of this early 14th century. They are two different things. They're two different military models. They basically have nothing to do with each other, right? From a strictly military point of view, and we will see it better now. But the point I was making is that infantry did advance next to cavalry, maybe behind it. Preferably, I think that infantry wings were much more spread than we think, even before they were substantially documented, since the late 13th century especially, because they were documented for the first time, right? But the fact that people wouldn't tell you that this was a big deal is because probably normally they had always done. It's just that infantries were less documented. Mostly, in fact, cavalry was decisive, and so nobody really cared, even in chronicles that are normally concise, to say, okay, there was infantry. Everybody knew that, right? And it's just, what did the cavalry do? Because that's what eventually brings to the end of the thing. Because, without cavalry, the infantry collapsed at the end of the day. So what actually it did, it's comforting cavalry action, very often clashing against other infantry, for example, on the enemy wings, and then if these collapsed, kind of falling on the enemy cavalry that was fighting with your own on their flanks, and so passing to old kind of close combat, like not even pikes too were using close combat, telling the truth, in even in this kind of more broken formation situation. But speaking about halberds, falchions, bills, cleavers, and all these things, yes, cleavers too, at least they were called that, because the terminology is very very varied and heterogeneous, according to the various dialects, to the various types, the ages, etc. But more or less, we're talking about the same weapons that had both a blunt and cutting, and sometimes even piercing effect, especially the bill had this. Eventually, it evolved in ways that were in fact very sophisticated, also for the same fencing to be carried out, and that tells you a lot about the same civilizations. We'll see it better now. And so the defensive, say, originary defensive vocation of communal infantries was naturally inherited by the characteristics of feudal war, right? It was expressed not much in the tactics per se. In fact, we mostly see infantry on the field, especially when it was abandoned by cavalry. You can't see the action, right? By essentially gathering around a rally point, like it could be the famous Carroccio, right, of the Italian people, because very often they say the Carroccio was the communal symbol. No, it was the one of the people, just not even of the knights. That's very interesting as well, because there were conflicts, as a matter of fact, between the commoners and the milites, and we have discussed this eventually. And the Carroccio could be moved. It was a wagon, right? There were wagon forts actually used throughout all Western warfare. At least they're documented in Lombardy during the 12th century, for example. And people say, the war wagon eventually later on with the Hussites. The war wagon had always been there, right? It's, and it's not really the best thing you can use. It's not a revolutionary thing. It's just, again, war adapting to the context, and eventually things move on and armies become more sophisticated. And actually, when we look at the success of wagon forts, it's because of very specific regional military balance, not because it was in absolute terms, again, the technologistic obsession, the thing, or an improvement in infantry warfare. That's absolute nonsense, right? And I'm still surprised by the sensationalism, the kind of firework kind of mentality of the so-called the military revolution and all this other amenities that frankly do not find any dignity of cultural worth in historical knowledge, in my opinion, especially military historical knowledge, for that matter. If you hear people talking about this, just know that they are incompetent. I can assure you, personally, and send them to me, please, because they will be severely punished. Let's put it in this way. In any case, there was a symbolism. That's also the idea that we have lost properly a vision, a meaning in the same army per se, right? The Carroccio, in a sense, embodied the parish, right? It had a bell on it. It was a kind of a bell tower, right? And the people fighting around, that they thought it was their own city in many ways. The armament, in a way, reflected it per se. For example, the infantry lengths tended to lengthen of up to 3-4 meters, and transforming itself into what in Italy was known as the lanza lunga or gialda. In Flanders it was known as pike, so that it would be, you see, even just the terminological differentiation. It's the same thing. They're just pikes. They're long lances. It's just a long bow. So they have nothing special. They existed since prehistory. Everybody used it, always, ever, right? What happened, again, is that in this time, these communities had finally the moral force to stand their ground with it, and mostly, as you understand, as a pike, because that's what it does, against cavalry. That was largely the problem. Infantry fought with the spears against each other, of course, but the length here was mostly meant to be anti-cavalry in many ways, or also anti-infantry, but prevalently to counter the cavalry lengths that, interestingly enough, at the beginning of the 13th century shortened, right? And this suggests that cavalry wouldn't even charge these guys, that at least frontally, right? At some point, this is what happened. This is my theory, because I specialized exactly in these things, and that, of course, the infantry stood on the wings and they took each other out. The decisive arm was the cavalry in the center. Once the enemy cavalry was broken, the enemy cavalry could simply turn around the various infantry wings, that were not supposed to change front once they were deployed, right? They could maneuver, they could carry, they could wheel. We know that. They were trained for doing that. But they couldn't resist to attack from the rear, from the side. This is typical conceptually. Similarly, it was not the same thing, but with the phalanx in many ways. This medieval communal infantry were much more aggressive in a way, mentally, but they lacked the training. So it was always the thing. They were very often individually loaded as single people. We know that some of them probably they didn't have any fear in dealing with cavalry, but they would do it in, I don't know, more fortified context, etc. There are similar things that are documented in places like Lombardy, like Flanders, just in open field. When these armies also began to be something up to 30,000 men, the Italian communal ones were something astonishing, right? And that's why before we were talking about the mostly the main, like the infantry wings appear for the first time actually in the Italian armies, right, on a regular basis, like essentially 60 years before the English ones of Edward III, of the 100 Years' War. So that, and we're talking about massive numbers, and the English wings were also technically mostly missile troopers, right? The Italians had less because they had more crossbows, but they relied also on this kind of properly bulky anti-cavalry function that they had, considering in this sense that the English center was still, yes, men-at-arms, but dismounted. So there are important differences, but in many ways the Italian ones were unique in their own regard, and they're a massive chapter. It's one of those armies that should become iconic about medieval times, that nobody cares or even knows they existed in a sense, in popular culture at least. You have no idea how provincial and bigoted international historiography is, right? It's, again, that damn hyper-specialization has cut even properly international connections, that comprehensive vision. It's hallucinating. In any case, cavalry stood away from those people, right? Their lengths shortened because, again, it was about mostly winning around them. Some would charge into them. We know that. There is an example of these, the so-called, especially in the Italian communal armies, there was this first line of breakers that were known as feditori, that were meant properly to break through in the first head. They were ultra-elite heavy cavalry, but kind of insane, like fanatic kind of type. And some of them, at a point, would charge into this man and would all end up impaled. Like, we have just one evidence of that. Normally they wouldn't do it. This is the point, and that's why this is the point. If it had been a normal thing, we would be overly documented about that, or we would assume at least that if this terribly stupid medieval knights that charged against anything without caring about anything were actually stupid. Instead, it doesn't happen. Surprise, surprise. Yes, was stupid really in terms of historical perspective. The idea, of course, that there were quite specialized and functionalized collective tactics, right, that were reflected by this type of, in fact, further infantry specialties, together with the bow pavese, the crossbow pavese. These troops were a formidable wall, right? The role of the pavese is also controversial. People think that this was just the camping table fixed on the ground with a literal guy that just was meant to be there to cover the archer, etc. The reality being that, especially in this early era, we see the pavese was large, just as other shields were different types. I think the actual divide was that it was thicker than the others. It was just specific for, even from the etymology, which is the same one of pavement, that comes from Latin and means literally to make sounder, more solid just by beating, by layering it fundamentally. And the pavese appears also in other areas, like, for example, Lithuania. That you can't think it was actually one of the most militarily advanced in Europe, but given the importance there that it had, especially during the Mongol era in the 13th century, when the Lithuanian knights had to confrontate with the Mongol archery, etc., that kind of makes the thing. Also, the squared shape, you find it in this half crescents that stretches, in fact, from Russia to the Balkans, and that all this Slavic infantry is coping with nomadic steppes, right? And the reason why it eventually develops in Italy and spreads dramatically, but it exists in other countries. At least, the Italian one is the one that takes over the area from which it takes over the continent, is crossbow fire, likely, because again there was hardly any other country where the volume of crossbow bolts was so intense, like among properly central northern Italy, where Contamine also says it was the most highly belligerent area in Europe. Like, the sheer amount of demographic and economical resources burned by Italians on the battlefields were like no others, right? Comparatively, in relative terms, possibly and easily in absolute terms, if you count all the city-states altogether, it's astonishing, right? It's utterly astonishing. And also for those people who talk about, pitched battles in the Middle Ages were rare. Yeah, so rare. Basically, they happened every year in some regions, right? We're talking about tens of thousands of people. Like, they're not rare at all, right? They are just less than the other types of warfare. But let's say also, how do you distinguish actually a pitched battle from also kind of a smaller engagement that is still kind of a pitched battle of some sort? And this is, again, the categorism and schematism and properly incompetence of people who have just read these phrases somewhere and then have to repeat them, but they haven't actually studied the battlefield. They haven't actually studied the chronicles. They haven't studied the campaigns. They haven't reconstructed them. They haven't counted them. They haven't seen literally the entire, like as a bird's eye, normally over generations, how certain European regions fought or interacted with others as well. And so they just vaguely speak of the Middle Ages, even in saying, in the late Middle Ages was different from the early. Yeah, but do you even know, again, in detail, what they're talking about? Of course, no, most of the times. And the truth being, it seems that the pavese was worn by the same pikeman, just like on one of the shoulders, right, with a strap. Very often the infantrymen, the pikemen, were cuirassed as well, right, and heavy infantry that could even pass to the sword if they didn't have room to maneuver. And in some instances, they even attacked cavalry, right, before it could form, or some things like that. So we're talking about really aggressive people, and these were professionals, right? So eventually, in medieval warfare, we realized that while the stopping infantry declines in the mid-14th century, actually the pavese men and the crossbowmen remain as kind of more specialized troops, but cavalry retakes over much of the power lost by the seized previously by the stopping infantry. So there's a refeudalization of warfare actually during the 14th and the 15th centuries. I will never exhaust myself of repeating. And so this host was really formidable in battle, right? This infantry wings could look like fortresses, right? And they seemed like a mobile battlement, and they were actually meant to represent a city wall, their own city, right? The same paveses in the front had all the communal emblems, etc., and they provided with a dramatic spectacle, not just a practical functionality against the enemy bolts, and still having the same guy again with the pavese covering himself during that moment, but also standing his ground with a pike held with both hands. And these units followed, by the way, cavalry, step by step. Cavalry also didn't run anywhere. They charged at very close distance, and it was vital to have the infantry on protecting them on the flanks to avoid in fact flank attacks from concealed reserves that, however, were were very often directed against the same infantry wings in the process, while they were pressured also by the frontal enemy wings and crossbow fire. It was even more important for properly unhinging and softening up, disordering the pikemen's wings than the cavalry during the clashes, right? This is quite meaningful because once you had crushed the enemy wing, you could simply fall on the enemy enemy cavalry flank from that side, and so everything was that well balanced, and the two arms cooperated as a unit. So actually a full integration, synergy, and cooperation between knights and commoners in that sense. And this is true especially in communal civilization, but don't think, say that, I don't know, probably more feudal armies wouldn't fight in the same way, right? They're very often less documented. Also, the type of people who wrote for them that mirror that different culture, different political and social system, of course, talk less about infantry, and probably also because infantry equally was less important, but by, small grades, right, compared to the European average, right? European armies more or less were like all the same, right? There were differences, but the options were basically the same. And there is a passage from the Chronicle of Dino Compagni, a Florentine politician, that we quoted also recently in that video about the Florentine feuds, etc. And there are these contexts, right, of that brutal ferocity of the intercommunal struggles, describing the famous battle of Campaldino, 1289. People say, oh, well, everybody knows it, if anything, because Dante allegedly participated in it. And some say otherwise it would be kind of not so relevant. Well, actually not, because if you look at the forces involved, we're talking about tens of thousands forces alone from the Florentine side. The Aretinians were something like 8,800. So we're not talking about small engagements, right? There were battles that were smaller, but that passed down to history in the same years, right, for some reason. And Campaldino marked the start of Florentine hegemony in Tuscany. It's a very relevant battle. We will have to discuss it at some point. But today we just quote Compagni about the battle because it's really a beautiful source, first of all, but it can help also understanding better what we're discussing today. So he said, the order the Florentines moved their insignia to go into the enemy land against Arezzo, that was the Tuscan neighbor of Florence. And they passed through the Casentino, which is a province, in fact, between Florence and Arezzo, for bad ways, harsh ways, where if they had found the enemies, they would have received much damage, which is also very interesting because it shows you how it could be ambushed, and such thing had already happened. The year before, the Aretinians had successfully ambushed the Siennese at Pieve di Toppo, where the Guelphs suffered heavy casualties. And these Aretinians, as you will see, were pretty warlike, were some of the most still properly crude, traditional, Apenninic, brutal, violent kind of mentality that even the Florentines were much more civilized, were much more French influenced. In fact, the Aretinians thought that they were kind of effeminate as well. The Aretinians maybe had even a kind of, can't exaggerate when talking about a more Longobarд background. They even shave, whereas the Florentines did. Again, the French way. So it was also this kind of interesting contrast between, of course, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines that had also kind of pro-French, pro-German bias in that regard. In any case, it goes on, but it says, Compagni says, but God didn't want this to happen, to the Florentines to be ambushed. And so the Florentines reached Bibbiena, in a place known as Campaldino, where the enemies were. And here they stopped, and they lined up, like they made up a battle line. The captains of war placed the feditori, these are the aforementioned elite line breakers, let's say, in front of the battle line, and the pavises, the shields specifically, with the white field and the red lily, that was the symbol of Florence, by the way, and it was mirroring also their pro-French alliance, right, with the French fleur de lis, were disposed in the front, with the pavises, so in front of the line, by men who were at least holding them, like in the advanced ranks. And at that point, the bishop is talking about the bishop of Arezzo, that was short-sighted, asked, those walls, what are they? And he was answered, the pavises of the enemy. And this phrase is beautiful, right? Because it gives you properly the emotional, before even the visual sensation of how intimidating this battle arrays actually were. And there is this other interesting passage that says, Messer Barone de Mangiadori from San Miniato, who was a brave and expert knight in matters of war, having summoned all the men-at-arms from the Florentine side, told them, gentlemen, the wars of Tuscany were used to be won for assaulting well, charging well. They didn't last, and a few men died in it, because it was not in use to kill them. Now the way has changed, and the battles are won to stay, well, steady, right? And for which I advise you to be strong and to let the enemy assault you. And so they disposed to do. This phrase is fantastic, and it also sparked lots of interesting debates, because it's not entirely clear what it means from a strictly tactical point of view. The thing here is that the Tuscans, the Welsh, had participated, especially to some of the largest battles fought in Europe at the time, that were the ones essentially for the throne of Sicily. So Charles of Anjou versus Manfred of Hohenstaufen at Benevent, and Conradin of Swabia against Charles of Anjou at Tagliacozzo, and there was plenty of Italian allies, some of the same people that fought at Campaldino again. And the idea is that this Transalpine forces were bringing in also the Sicilian, the Swabian forces were bringing in this kind of more feudal culture that had fully developed in the 13th century by normally 3 battle lines and their strict coordination. So when Barone says, because Barone is a name, by the way, it's not Baron, right? It's literally a name, once they use it at the time. Says, let them assault. It doesn't really mean like stay idle, right? Also because the Florentines here, we don't see it, but they had an overwhelming advantage in cavalry. So like more than two times. So it would have been just nonsensical not to attack. So there are many still. The reconstruction of Campaldino is one of the most interesting things ever, because I'm convinced that all historiography got it wrong and have very specific reasons to think why, but seemingly they don't. And I will write surely something about this at some point. And the point was there to maintain the order of the formation, right? Not to come out of the battle line to prove that you were the better knight, etc. Because it happened all the time. If you look at, the Battle of Bouvines, we also made a video there. You see that knights became this kind of ballet, this back and forth, right? The Italians call it badalucco, which was, this kind of almost onomatopoeic idea of going back and forth, clashing, of this purely kind of knightly chivalric idea. At this point he says, watch this thing, because now we will be winning if we maintain our battle lines compact. And Campagna goes on and says, and so they disposed. The Aretinians assaulted the field, which means they attacked, they charged so vigorously and with so much strength that the Florentine battle line very strongly almost withdrew. Right, it had this kind of shock, and it was broken. There is actually another important source of the battle, which is Villani, who explains that, however, the line managed to regroup, but this was a massive blow, and it shows the Aretinians were very confident in this kind of, because they were dramatically inferior in number, so objectively that was their best choice, right, to try to break all at a time, Villani says, and they almost succeeded in doing so. And Campagna goes on and says, and the battle was harsh and hard, and the newly united that had been made, in fact, had been dubbed from one side and the other, contributed to this because they were the most vigorous, the ones who wanted to show off, etc. And Messer Corso Donati, we're talking about the Donati and Cherokee War exactly. So it's interesting that in that video about the Florentine vendetta that we made to find him back. In fact, we were talking about him there. He says, with the brigade of the Pistoians, attacked the enemies from the side. So this was the reserve they had in, say, from the side of the formation, out of the battle lines that were deployed in depth. And this guy was the Podestà of Pistoia. He was a major Florentine magnate, right? And he had been called in Pistoia to be Podestà, which was mostly in fact, like in this case, he commanded the Pistoiese force in the battle as a military commander. It says the crossbow bolts were hailing. The Aretinians had a few of them, and they were attacked from the side, because they were uncovered. And my interpretation is that because given they had a few crossbow ammo, their wing collapsed earlier when it was attacked also from the flank by the enemy. So that's why. But they kept on fighting, the cavalry as well and others. And Campagna says, and the air was covered with clouds. I mean, because of the dust, right? You know, and the dust, in fact, was great. The infantrymen, this is interesting, of the Aretinians placed themselves crouched under the horses' belly, and with their knives they disemboweled them. And of the Aretinian feditori, say the Aretinian feditori attacked so much, right? They also charged multiple times. This is my translation. That in the mid of the battle line, lots of people were killed from both sides, and many. So this is interesting about the medieval chronicle. It stops here. Everybody knew that this was written like 20 years after the battle, something like that. It was a bit a legendary. I say not legendary because it was quite fresh historical memory, but it was like the big triumphal moment in which Florence had defeated Arezzo, the hated neighbor. So it was a major thing, and there is no need here. It doesn't say, the battle was won because, I don't know, Corso Donati attacked from the side, etc. We just have an idea that this thing happened, right? And then we have to try to reconstruct what happened. But many that day that were estimated of great courage were vile, and many of whom that were not discussed were instead estimated. This is interesting because you see what they care about. It doesn't even tell you how the battle went, but it was important to say that some people that were estimated as courageous instead behaved cowardly, and some people that nobody cared about instead proved to be valiant. This is a big deal. It tells you how deeply the moral concerns were for these people. Great prize had the bailiff of the captain that died there, because the Florentine army was commanded by Amaury de Narbonne, who was a provincial commander who had also this bailiff that actually was in actual command, that was going to Naples from France because of the usual Angevin connection, and so he was passing by Florence because that was on the road and was the most important Guelph city in Italy. So the Florentines asked him, like, you don't want to be our commander? He said yes, and that's how it went. This is interesting because there were French Provençal troops within them as well. So much that actually the actual commander-in-chief had been killed. The Artinians put up a terrible fight, right? You understand here. And again, we have to talk about Campaldino at some point. But here, anyhow, it says, Bindo del Baschiera Tosinghi, there's a magnate, was hurt, and so he came back to Florence, but after a few days he died of it, right? This is kind of typical. From the side of the enemies, also the bishop of Arezzo was killed. The bishop of Arezzo was a very warlike figure. We will see him now, of the Ubertini family. These were, again, tough Apenninic stocks of lords, properly military lineages, right? They made war as a living, and bishops, as you know, in medieval times were pretty warlike in the first place. This guy was killed, was one of the most important figures in Tuscany at that point. Then Messer Guglielmino de' Pazzi, there was a brave knight who was, by the way, this was a Florentine exile into Arezzo. This is interesting. Buonconte and Loccio da Montefeltro. And Buonconte is very famous. We will talk about him now in a while, so Dante discusses him because his corpse was never found. And there's all the legend that Dante makes when he talks about him in the Purgatory. Another valiant man. And the Count Guido didn't. This was Guido Novello. He was another nobleman who instead was the equivalent of Corso Donati, who was placed with a reserve on the side of the battlefield that he did not attack. It says he didn't wait for the end, but without unseating his sword, he left because he probably saw. We don't know what happened actually, but he may have been bought, or maybe he saw that the Florentines were just too many. Very well, Messer Vieri de' Cerchi proved himself, and one of his sons, a knight at his side. The Aretinians were broken, not because of cowardice or by scarce bravery capacity, but because, in fact, of the overwhelming amount of the enemy, because there were too many. The Aretinians were put to flight and were killed. The Florentine soldiers that were used to be defeated, because Florence didn't really perform that well, military speaking. Telling this Ghibellines, in fact, that's why Campaldino is a big deal for them. They won the wars, this is true, but the battles usually against, especially these Ghibelline warlords, they tended to lose pretty much, and they would keep doing it, that, by the way. And they killed them. This is interesting. He speaks of Florentine soldiers, which means in this sense mercenaries, actually, that were tired of being defeated. And the fact that tired of being defeated means that they had been under Florentine contract for long enough in Italy. And now they were pissed off and they were killing. See what the mercenaries do, they kill. Like the guys before, they disemboweled the knights' horses there. And it says the villains didn't have any mercy. So the peasantry, the vulgus, the most brutally violent element of society throughout all history. This is the point, and we will discuss it today. Messer Talano Adimari and his own came back to their place. Here we don't know what it really means, probably their home, not a place in the battlefield, because they went back and forth like in the battle line. In fact, it says many citizens of Florence that had the cavallate, that were basically that kind of military duty performance, because how rich they were, they had to provide mounted military service. It says they didn't move, and many didn't know anything, if not when the enemies were broken, which suggests that battlefields were extending for kilometers, right? And they So this suggests there were also probably more than 2 lines, as is usually told, and that some of these battle lines didn't know until, in fact, the enemy was broken, maybe hundreds of meters or even kilometers ahead, right? This is very interesting also for explaining the kind of the battlefield space's dimensions. And they didn't even run and the Aretinians didn't run with victory because they hoped that with a few they would have gotten it, right? So instead it didn't, and then the battle. Okay, we will not digress on the battle on the campaign because that's also interesting, but just to point out some things about this brutal violence of the infantry that we will highlight. So that thing we were saying before about the infantry is properly mirroring a city. The mistake of the bishop of Arezzo that couldn't see that well and had exchanged the white-red pavises of the Florentines for city walls was not maybe just much of a mistake, because he had probably seen it right. They did look like a wall. And Campaldino is a clash between similar forces, after all. I mean, it's pretty homogeneous Tuscan reality between essentially enriched communal estates that are fighting, let's say, that are also knowing each other. We've seen there are exiles, some of these people are married into each other, etc. Then there are some also feudal contingents. There are the Guidi counts, for example, that are more this kind of Apenninic stocks, the Bertini, the Montefeltro as well, great Apenninic mercenaries, but kind of more properly feudal lineages of the feud that had survived on the outskirts of the Italian plains, or at least the most fertile areas where the communes had taken over, right, where these guys remain instead in the mountains and mostly specializing as mercenaries. They could offer their service as podestas, as mercenaries as well as trainers. The Montefeltro would train the peasant militia into a deadly killing machine that also in fact inflicted severe losses to Florence at Montecatini in 1315. So we're talking about, again, people who knew each other, who kind of were habituated to warfare. Like, they knew how war was made, right? And they fought all in the same way. Everything was rather homogeneous at this point. Even the tactics as have been reconstructed, Campaldino rose a lot of issues, but let's say they were actually identical, right? The way they were deployed, the way they fought, it was the same, including the infantry wings. And at the same time, there is, especially because of the speech that Compagni writes, we don't know, of Barone de Mangiadori, who says, look, here things have changed. Like, there is an awareness, at least in the early 14th century Tuscan mentality, that war had changed from the previous generations. So it's essentially very clear, aside from many other things we could say, at least to simplify, that there is a passage from a feudal to a communal type of war. And the latter, especially, is characterized by an intensification of brutality and by a restriction of what many authors define as such as Zinke, by the way, the ludic component of war, which I am absolutely against as a concept, right? It's not that there is not a dimension of gamble and liking in it, because the second person in the Clausewitzian Trinity is exactly that, the military gamble, right? And so this randomness that attracts people, the chaos in many ways, that's what war is. But it's not because it was an actual ritual war. It was kind of, playful. People didn't really kill each other per se. It was just, war was at some point less or more or less, it's properly defined, more or less brutal than it is. This is actually what Barone says instead. He says, we didn't kill them before, but it's not because you didn't break them. This mostly spoke of the pursuit and who you actually pursued. Like, because if they were knights, they would of course be normally ransomed if taken alive, right? The problem now is that there are also a lot of commoners, and commoners don't give a fuck about that, And however, you cannot actually draw a line between the two. You can simply say, well, here we're just talking about the feudal type of war and the commoners type of war. No. Because if you study actually the art of war there was happening, you realize these armies were ever larger and more performing. And if you wanted to crush one another, you had necessarily to kill more. Right? This is not about what you have to do after the battle, whether killing or not killing the people you capture. This is about winning the freaking battle. It's combat, which is what most military historians paradoxically do not study. Right? If you don't study combat, you cannot study military history. It doesn't make any sense. Right? You can't say, well, I will study, I don't know, military production, or that's not even truly military history. If you circle around what war is, that is killing people, you cannot properly understand what war is, right? So the speech of Barone is actually very correct instead, because he says, that there is, before it was one charge, and basically who won there among the knights had won everything, and more or less the knights still controlled everything. He said now it's a much bigger thing. It's a much more complex tactics, right? It's more brutal, exactly, because in this complexity can make the difference between victory and defeat. And that complexity brings to more attrition, to more control that you have to maintain, more discipline, and so tougher soldiers that also, if they want to break each other, they have to kill each other more likely. And also they want to kill each other afterwards more likely. These are the moral and material forces of communal civilization booming exactly in the years of Campaldino. This is the time also of the Edicts of Justice, the Giano della Bella statutes that properly show the people organizing in a paramilitary force, an unprecedented level of power, the expansion of Florence, the increase of in the frequency of warfare, of battles, right? Florence was one of the few, only Milan could afford